Welcome to the Shaw Consulting Podcast. In this episode, we're focusing on cyber assurance and resilience across social housing, care and local government. As cyber threats grow in scale and impact, are organisations truly prepared? And more importantly, are boards confident they can govern cyber risk effectively? I'm your host, Stuart, and I'm joined by Shaw Consulting MD, Chris Shaw, and our new Associate Director of Cyber Assurance, Ian Whitwell. Hi both.
Hi, Stuart.
Hi, Stuart. Good to be here.
Good to have you both today. Right, Chris, let's just start with you. Let's start with the big picture. So cybersecurity has been on the agenda for years. So what's changed? Why is cyber now such a critical board level issue?
The shift is really about the impact and accountability. Cyber incidents are no longer just technical problems. They directly affect service delivery, tenant trust, regulatory compliance, and organizational resilience. At the same time, expectations have changed. Boards are now expected to understand cyber risk, own it, and evidence that it's being managed effectively. So the conversation has moved from, are our systems secure, to can we withstand, respond, and recover from a cyber event? And that's fundamentally the different question.
So there's a real shift there, isn't there, Chris? And it's something that boards have got to grapple with perhaps in not the way they've had to consider in the past. So Ian, if we can just bring you in. So you've joined from a senior role in social housing. So from your experience, where do organisations typically stand today in terms of cyber readiness?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I think, working in a senior role in housing IT, there's strong responsibility for all things cyber. I think the thing that has really struck me the most in recent years is the real mix, but there's a common theme in the gap between perception and reality. And, most organizations, as we did, invested heavily in technology, firewalls, endpoint protection monitoring. And obviously that's important. But I think what's less clear is really whether, those controls we've got are actually working in practice. Also, are the roles and responsibilities understood outside of IT? Do staff understand their critical role in keeping the organization safe? And, the key theme to me is cybersecurity is everyone's business, not just IT. Other key themes are looking at your incident response plan. Would they hold up under pressure? Are third-party risks properly governed? So on paper, things can look strong, but when you test them, particularly at board level and exec level, gaps can start to emerge.
So I think what you're saying there, Ian, is a bit of a difference between what's on those board papers and what takes place in reality.
Yeah, it's really, do the actions that are being assumed to be being done, are they actually being done, and are they being done effectively?
That's really interesting, Ian. Chris, you've often talked about the difference between cybersecurity and cyber assurance. Just for our listeners, could you just explain what that actually means?
Yeah, sure. So cybersecurity is what you do. Cyber assurance is how you know it works. So for a lot of organizations, they focus on activity, they implement the tools, they're writing the policies, they're running the tests. But boards don't need activity, they need assurance. They need to know what their actual risk exposure is, whether controls are effective, whether they could defend their position to a regulator, and whether they're ready to make decisions during a live incident. That's why we position our work as independent, governance-led assurance. And, we translate cyber into business risk and give boards clarity, not technical noise.
Thanks, Chris. So it's about giving them that better understanding about what their responsibilities are there, and also the importance of those responsibilities to the overall governance of the organisation.
Yeah, that's it, definitely.
So Ian, one of the areas that often gets little attention or overlooked is actually people and culture within this. So how important is that in cyber resilience?
My view is it's absolutely critical. As I said earlier, cybersecurity is everyone's business, not just IT. And technology can only take you so far. And you look at most of the incidents, there have been some pretty high profile ones recently. And when you look at them, you find that they actually involve some form of human behavior, whether that's phishing or poor access management or process failure. The human element is key. And what we look at really is how well do staff understand their role in cyber risk within IT and within the business generally, and certainly for staff, how do they know how to spot a potential cyber incident? And most importantly, how to report it and how well that's dealt with. whether the general policies are followed in a day-to-day in the operations team, how people respond when something goes wrong, and whether leadership sets the right tone. Ensuring that the organizational culture is no blame. When you encounter a cyber incident, making sure reporting is the key thing and encouraging staff to actually take that positive attitude. And in housing and care in particular, wherever services are people-led, culture is often the difference between a near miss and potentially a major incident.
Yeah, I think we've all heard about some of the incidents recently, whether sort of M&S incident or within the social housing sector, there's been quite a number reported.
Yeah, they've pretty much all been human error, human behaviour, and people in key roles have unfortunately fallen victim to, some form of phishing attack, and that's what's actually caused the initial breach.
One of the things you picked up on there, Ian, was leadership. So, Chris, let's just talk about boards and exec teams. So, cyber can still feel quite abstract at that level. So, how do you make it real for them?
I think the most effective way is through simulation. So when you put a board or an exec team into a realistic scenario, they've been struck by ransomware, they've had a data breach, or they've had, one of their key suppliers fail. That conversation changes immediately. The posture should be, when, not if, a successful cyber attack occurs. So suddenly it's not theoretical. It's who makes the decision? Do we shut our systems down? Who speaks to the regulator? What do we tell our tenants and staff? And do we have a communication strategy with potential templates in place to cover cyber incidents? And, through those sessions, they're incredibly powerful because they expose gaps in governance, communication, and decision making very quickly. And importantly, they build confidence. Leaders leave with a much clearer understanding of their role.
So, this scenario training is a bit of a wake up call.
I think so, definitely. I mean, it gets people ready. It helps them understand what they need to do to prepare effectively.
So, just looking beyond the organisation, obviously, we don't work in isolation. So, Ian, supply chain risk is obviously becoming a bigger issue across these various sectors that Shaw operates in. So, how exposed are organisations in that space?
I think probably more than they realised, to be honest, Stuart. I mean, again, back to my previous role, it was clear that we had incidents where suppliers had been compromised and the people they were in contact with in our organisation were trusting those people because they'd spoken to them on a regular basis by email. And it's very easy to become complacent and think you're actually dealing with the same person, but you're not. You're dealing with someone who's actually phishing or causing some sort of pressure on that person, thinking that they're actually not who they say they are. And it's more about visibility of controls on those suppliers and contractors and partners. Now, for example, in housing, you've got repairs contractors, you've got software providers who are often providing all sorts of third-party services. You've got care providers, you've got managed service providers, and you may well have outsourced certain aspects of cybersecurity. And how do you know that those suppliers are doing what they say they're doing in terms of keeping you safe? And each of those introduce risk, particularly where there's system access or data sharing involved. And again, that was a common theme for us. We couldn't do everything. We had to rely on our suppliers. And we often see that supplier assurance is treated as a one-off procurement exercise rather than an ongoing governance issue, an assurance issue. And that's a gap because many real-world cyber incidents originate through supply chain. And, from my own knowledge of those recent high-profile attacks, that's exactly where they came from. It was actually supply chain compromise that was the issue.
So, you might actually have your own house in order, but it's your supply chain that's actually the issue.
Exactly. On all levels, whether they're supplying a cyber service, whether they're supplying a repair service, whether they're supplying just some form of business to business service to people totally outside of the IT sphere. So, the whole thing is one of, assurance and understanding of what those risks are and how you can assure board and senior management that those risks are being managed.
Okay, so Chris, let me just bring you back in if that's all right. Shaw Consulting's very clear. One of the things you always say is about being independent and not selling technology. But why is that so important in this space?
So independence, really gives credibility, Stuart. If you're also selling tools or managed services, there's always a risk that advice is influenced by that. And because we don't, we can challenge assumptions, validate controls objectively, and, most importantly, give boards a clear, unbiased view on their position. That's particularly important when you're dealing with the audit committees or the regulators. They want assurance they can rely on, not a sales narrative.
So, finally, for organisations listening to this and thinking, where do we actually start? What would your advice be, Ian?
Thanks, Stuart. I think just understanding your current position properly, not just a checklist, but a genuine assessment of the key fundamentals here. So looking at governance, our senior management team and board fully aware and assured that the right controls are in place. Obviously, mentioning controls, what are the controls? How well are those understood at senior management and board? What's the risk exposure? Looking at, cyber risk as a corporate risk, making sure that that's clearly documented. And perhaps most importantly, I would say, is culture. Does the organisation see that cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility, not just IT? And that, really needs to come right from the very top. The board, senior management team, senior leaders, managers, and all the officers in the organisation. The whole picture to me is having a culture which says you accept that it's really when, not if, a cyber attack is going to occur. So you take that approach that it's going to happen. What are we doing to make sure that we've got the right approach to deal with it? And then prioritize the basics. So I think there's obviously clear ownership of cyber risk. How's that handled? How often is it being reviewed and managed? That you test your incident response plans, again, following back to that when, not if. Again, touched on previously, visibility of third-party risk. Again, everybody assumes that all your suppliers are doing what they say they're doing. Are they really? And then I think, that last level of assurance, how meaningful and reporting to the board is the cyber risk and the controls that you've got in place, and things like the way that you would look at improving it. Have you got a clear strategy for that? Is that being communicated to the board and the organisation in general? But yeah, you don't need to do everything at once, but you need a clear, realistic roadmap. That's really where I'd say that I'd start in terms of understanding your current position.
And Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Yeah, I mean, I'd add as well, just involve the board early. Cyber isn't something to fix in IT and then report upwards. It needs to be owned at the top of the organisation from the outset. If boards understand the risk and have confidence in the assurance around it, everything else becomes much easier to manage.
Excellent. And that wraps up another Shaw Consulting Social Housing Technology podcast. Chris, Ian, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah.
So if you'd like to find out anything more about the cyber assurance service from Shaw, you can contact Chris or Ian via LinkedIn or via the website. Thanks very much for listening, and keep an eye out for future episodes from Shaw Consulting. Thank you.